Hello, this is part 4 of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, the final section of this essay. This part discusses the three main virtues of fairy stories, according to Tolkien: recovery, escape, and consolation. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are, and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need, in any case, to clear our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces, those of our familiars are the ones most difficult to play fantastic tricks with, and most difficult, really, to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness. That they are faces, and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or in a bad sense familiar, are the things that we have appropriated, legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their color, or their shape, and we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquiring them, and acquiring ceased to look at them. Of course, fairy stories are not the only means of recovery or prophylactic against loss. Humility is enough, and there is, especially for the humble, moroefic or Chestertonian fantasy. Moroefic is a fantastic word, but it could be seen written up in every town in this land. It is coffee room, viewed from the inside through a glass door, as it was seen by Dickens on a dark London day, and it was used by Chesterton to denote the queerness of things that have become trite, when they are seen suddenly from a new angle. That kind of fantasy most people would allow to be wholesome enough, and it can never lack for material. But it has, I think, only a limited power, for the reason that recovery of freshness of vision is its only virtue. The word moroefic may cause you suddenly to realize that England is an utterly alien land, lost either in some remote past age glimpsed by history, or in some strange dim future to be reached only by a time machine. To see the amazing oddity and interest of its inhabitants and their customs and feeding habits. But it cannot do more than that. Act as a time telescope focused on one spot. Creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems all turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, wild and free, no more yours than they were you. The fantastic elements in verse and prose of other kinds, even when only decorative or occasional, help in this release, but not so thoroughly as a fairy story, a thing built on or about fantasy, of which fantasy is the core. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material, and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. By the forging of Graham, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stock, flower and fruit, are manifested in glory. And actually, fairy stories deal largely, or the better ones mainly, with simple or fundamental things, untouched by fantasy. But these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. For the story-maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover, not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words, and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. I will now conclude by considering escape and consolation, which are naturally closely connected. Though fairy stories are, of course, by no means the only medium of escape, they are today one of the most obvious and, to some, outrageous forms of escapist literature, and it is thus reasonable to attach to a consideration of them some considerations of this term escape in criticism generally. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently a rule very practical, and may even be heroic. In real life, it is difficult to blame it, unless it fails. In criticism, it would seem to be the worse the better it succeeds. Evidently, we are faced by a misuse of words, and also by a confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so, a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers, or any other Reich, and even criticism of it, as treachery. In the same way, these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only onto desertion, but onto real escape, and what are often its companions: disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Not only do they confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter, but they would seem to prefer the acquiescence of the Quisling to the resistance of the patriot. To such thinking, you have only to say, the land you love is doomed, to excuse any treachery, indeed, to glorify it. For a trifling instance, not to mention, indeed, not to parade, electric street lamps of mass-produced pattern in your tale is escape, in that sense. But it may, almost certainly does, proceed from a considered disgust for so typical a product of the robot age, that combines elaboration and ingenuity of means with ugliness, and often with inferiority of result. These lamps may be excluded from the tale simply because they are bad lamps, and it is possible that one of the lessons to be learned from the story is the realization of this fact. But out comes the big stick. Electric lamps have come to stay, they say. Long ago, Chesterton truly remarked that as soon as he heard anything had come to stay, he knew that it would be very soon replaced, indeed regarded as pitiably obsolete and shabby. The march of science, its tempo quickened by the needs of war, goes inexorably on, making some things obsolete and foreshadowing new developments in the utilization of electricity. An advertisement. This says the same thing, only more menacingly. The electric street lamp may indeed be ignored, simply because it is so insignificant and transient. Fairy stories, at any rate, have many more permanent and fundamental things to talk about. Lightning, for example. The escapist is not so subservient to the whims of evanescent fashion as these opponents. He does not make things, which it may be quite rational to regard as bad, his masters or his gods by worshipping them as inevitable, even inexorable. And his opponents, so easily contemptuous, have no guarantee that he will stop there. He might rouse men to pull down the street lamps. Escapism has another, even wickeder face: reaction. Not long ago, incredible though it may seem, I heard a clerk of Oxenford declare that he welcomed the proximity of mass-production robot factories and the roar of self-obstructive mechanical traffic, because it brought his university into, quote, contact with real life. He may have meant that the way men were living and working in the 20th century was increasing in barbarity at an alarming rate, and that the loud demonstration of this in the streets of Oxford may serve as a warning that it is not possible to preserve for long an oasis of sanity in a desert of unreason by mere fences, without actual offensive action, practical and intellectual. I fear he did not. In any case, the expression real life in this context seems to fall short of academic standards. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive, is the factory chimney compared with an elm tree? Poor, obsolete thing, insubstantial dream of an escapist. The, quote, rawness and ugliness of modern European life, that real life, whose contact we should welcome, is, quote, the sign of a biological inferiority or an insufficient or false reaction to environment. The maddest castle that ever came out of a giant's bag in the wild Gaelic stories is not only much less ugly than a robot factory, it is also, to use a very modern phrase, in a very real sense, a great deal more real. Why should we not escape from or condemn the, quote, grim Assyrian absurdity of top hats or the Morlockian horror of factories? They are condemned even by the writers of that most escapist form of all literature, stories of science fiction. These prophets often foretell, and many seem to yearn for, a world like one big glass-roofed railway station. But from them it is, as a rule, very hard to gather what men in such a world town would do. They may abandon the full Victorian panoply for loose garments with zip fasteners, but will use this freedom mainly, it would appear, in order to play with mechanical toys in the soon cloying game of moving at high speed. To judge by some of these tales, they will still be as lustful, vengeful, and greedy as ever, and the ideals of their idealists hardly reach farther than the splendid notion of building more towns of the same sort on other planets. It is indeed an age of improved means to deteriorated ends. It is part of the essential malady of such days, producing the desire to escape, not indeed from life, but from our present time and self-made misery, that we are acutely conscious both of the ugliness of our works and of their evil. So that to us, evil and ugliness seem indissolubly allied. We find it difficult to conceive of evil and beauty together. The fear of the beautiful fay that ran through the elder ages almost eludes our grasp. Even more alarming, goodness is itself bereft of its proper beauty. In fairy, one can indeed conceive of an ogre who possesses a castle hideous as a nightmare, for the evil of the ogre wills it so. But one cannot conceive of a house built with a good purpose, an inn, a hostel for travelers, the hall of a virtuous and noble king, that is yet sickeningly ugly. At the present day it would be rash to hope to see one that was not, unless it was built before our time. This, however, is the modern and special or accidental escapist aspect of fairy stories, which they share with romances and other stories out of or about the past. Many stories out of the past have only become escapist in their appeal through surviving from a time when men were, as a rule, delighted with the work of their hands into our time, when many men feel disgust with man-made things. But there are also other and more profound escapisms that have always appeared in fairy tale and legend. There are other things more grim and terrible to fly from than the noise, stench, ruthlessness, and extravagance of the internal combustion engine. There are hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death. And even when men are not facing hard things such as these, there are ancient limitations from which fairy stories offer a sort of escape, and old ambitions and desires, touching the very roots of fantasy, to which they offer a kind of satisfaction and consolation. Some are pardonable weaknesses or curiosities, such as the desire to visit, free as a fish, the deep sea, or the longing for the noiseless, gracious, economical flight of a bird, that longing which the aeroplane cheats, except in rare moments, seen high and by wind and distance noiseless, turning in the sun, that is, precisely when imagined and not used. There are profounder wishes, such as the desire to converse with other living things. On this desire, as ancient as the fall, is largely founded the talking of beasts and creatures in fairy tales, and especially the magical understanding of their proper speech. This is the root, and not the confusion, attributed to the minds of men of the unrecorded past, an alleged absence of the sense of separation of ourselves from beasts. A vivid sense of that separation is very ancient, but also a sense that it was a severance, a strange fate, and a guilt that lies on us. Other creatures are like other realms with which man has broken off relations, and sees now only from the outside at a distance, being at war with them, or on the terms of an uneasy armistice. There are a few men who are privileged to travel abroad a little. Others must be content with the traveler's tales. Even about frogs. In speaking of that rather odd but widespread fairy story, The Frog King, Max Muller asked in his prim way, How came such a story ever to be invented? Human beings were, we may hope, at all times sufficiently enlightened to know that a marriage between a frog and the daughter of a queen was absurd. Indeed, we may hope so. For if not, there would be no point in this story at all, depending, as it does essentially, on the sense of the absurdity. Folklore origins, or guesses about them, are here quite beside the point. It is of little avail to consider totemism. For certainly, whatever customs or beliefs about frogs and wells lie beyond this story, the frog shape was and is perceived in the fairy story precisely because it was so queer, and the marriage absurd, indeed abominable. Though, of course, in the versions which concern us, Gaelic, German, English, there is in fact no wedding between a princess and a frog. The frog was an enchanted prince. And the point of the story lies not in thinking frogs possible mates, but in the necessity of keeping promises, and even those with intolerable consequences, that, together with observing prohibitions, runs through all fairyland. This is one of the notes of the horns of Elfland, and not a dim note. And lastly, there is the oldest and deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. Fairy stories provide many examples and modes of this, which might be called the genuine escapist, or, I would say, fugitive spirit. But so do other stories, notably those of scientific inspiration, and so do other studies. Fairy stories are made by men, not fairies. The human stories of the elves are doubtless full of the escape from deathlessness. But our stories cannot be expected always to rise above our common level. They often do. Few lessons are taught more clearly in them than the burden of that kind of immortality, or rather endless serial living, to which the fugitive would fly. For the fairy story is especially apt to teach these things, of old and still today. But the consolation of fairy stories has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least, I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale, and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale, this joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and in so far as Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. Even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. It is not an easy thing to do. It depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, and yet it reflects a glory backwards. A tale that in any measure succeeds in this point has not wholly failed, whatever flaws it may possess, and whatever mixture or confusion of purpose. It happens even in Andrew Lang's own fairy story, Prince Prigio, unsatisfactory in many ways as that is. When each knight came alive, and lifted his sword and shouted, "Long live Prince Prigio," the joy has a little of that strange mythical fairy story quality, greater than the event described. It would have none in Lang's tale if the event described were not a piece of more serious fairy story fantasy than the main bulk of the story, which is in general more frivolous, having the half-mocking smile of the courtly, sophisticated Conte. Far more powerful and poignant is the effect in a serious tale of fairy. In such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire, that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I claim for thee, the bluidy shirt I rang for thee, and wilt thou not waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her. Epilogue. This joy which I have selected as the mark of the true fairy story or romance, or as the seal upon it, merits more consideration. Probably every writer making a secondary world, a fantasy, every sub-creator, wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that the peculiar quality of this secondary world, if not all the details, are derived from reality, or are flowing into it. If he indeed achieves a quality that can be fairly described by the dictionary definition, inner consistency of reality, it is difficult to conceive how this can be if the work does not in some way partake of reality. The peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction and an answer to that question, is it true? The answer to this question that I gave at first was, quite rightly, if you have built your little world well, yes, it is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist's part of the artist. But in that eucatastrophe, we see in a brief glimpse that the answer may be greater, It may be a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. The use of this word gives a hint of my epilogue. It is a serious and dangerous matter. It is presumptuous of me to touch upon such a theme, but if by grace what I say has in any respect any validity, it is, of course, only one facet of a truth incalculably rich, finite only because the capacity of man, for whom this was done, is finite. I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt-making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect, self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that man would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it either leads to sadness or wrath. It is not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy that one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true, its narrative to be history, without thereby necessarily losing the mythical or allegorical significance that it had possessed. It is not difficult, for one is not called upon to try and conceive anything of a quality unknown. The joy would have exactly the same quality, if not the same degree, as the joy which the turn in a fairy story gives. Such joy has the very taste of primary truth. Otherwise, its name would not be joy. It looks forward or backward. The direction in this regard is unimportant, to the great eucatastrophe. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it is preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not depress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy, still go on, and should go on. The evangelium has not abrogated legends. It has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian has still to work, with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose, which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated that he may now, perhaps, fairly dare to guess that in fantasy he may actually assist in the affoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet, at the last, redeemed, they may be as like and unlike the forms that we give them as man. Finally redeemed, we will be like and unlike the fallen that we know. This concludes Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. Thank you for watching.